The importance of the Mediterranean was vital to British planning before the Second World War, and the Royal Navy was tasked with protecting this sea route. Many of Britain's far-flung dominions were to the east of the Suez Canal. The route for raw materials and reinforcements through the Mediterranean via the canal was relatively fast. The alternative was the much longer and riskier journey round the Cape. So as to protect its sea lanes through the Mediterranean, Britain had long established two important strategic bases at either end of the inland sea. The first was the major facility at Gibraltar. The Rock, as it was known, was situated only 8 miles across the straits from North Africa and was the choke point commanding access to and egress from the Mediterranean. Gibraltar possessed an airfield, powerful radio equipment, and the miles of tunnels in the rock housed bomb-proof barracks, offices, and workshops. Its excellent harbour also provided a secure base for operations in the Central Atlantic. At the other end of the Mediterranean was the naval base at Alexandria in Egypt, the home port of the British Mediterranean Fleet. The fleet there controlled the eastern Mediterranean. It also protected the entry to the Suez Canal and the route to the Far East. Roughly midway between the two was the island of Malta and its small neighbour Gozo. The Grand Harbour at Valletta, the island's capital, provided refuelling and rearming facilities as well as substantial dockyards for repairs. However, to keep the base functioning, the island had to be kept supplied, particularly with fuel and ammunition. Situated only 60 miles from Sicily and 180 miles from Libya, the island fortress would become the linchpin of the British campaign in the Mediterranean. To the south of Malta lay the Italian territory of Libya. This was the gem in the crown of Mussolini's dream of a new Roman Empire in Africa. After the First World War, colonization by Italian nationals had been encouraged. They'd built up an impressive European infrastructure along the arid coastal strip. The territory was divided into Cyrenaica in the east and Tripolitania in the west. To the west of Libya lay the French North African colonies of Algeria and Tunisia. To the east lay British-controlled Egypt. During the interwar period, there had been a number of tribal revolts, and the Italians had built up a series of paved roads in order to move troops quickly to trouble spots. One such highway, the Via Imperiale, ran the whole length of Libya's Mediterranean coastline. Mussolini planned that, if the opportunity arose, it could be used for a rapid attack on Egypt, thereby securing the strategic Suez Canal and enlarging his North African empire. Italian naval doctrine envisaged the use of their fleet to both protect the homeland and to support their North African territories. To this end, during the 1930s, warship construction had built up an impressive battle fleet, and this was gradually added to during the war years. In 1937, the elderly battleships Caio Duilio and Andrea Doria went for rebuild. At the same time, the Conti di Cavour and the Giulio Cesare emerged from a 4-year reconstruction program. The same year, the 35,000-ton battleships Littorio and Vittorio Veneto were launched. They were armed with 9 15-inch and 12 6-inch guns. These warships were added to an Italian fleet that now comprised 6 battleships, 21 cruisers, and almost 150 destroyers. Most battleships and heavy cruisers were fitted with catapult-launched float planes to provide long-range reconnaissance. The Italian Navy, of course, expected to operate under land-based air superiority from both sides of the Mediterranean. Their only attempt to build aircraft carriers came too late. The Italians also built up a fleet of over 100 submarines. Most were designed to operate in the relatively shallow waters of the Mediterranean. They, together with their German U-boat allies, were to provide a considerable menace throughout the Second World War.
In the Horn of Africa, 1934 saw the culmination of a number of border disputes between the Italian colonies of Eritrea and Somaliland and independent Ethiopia. In October 1935, Mussolini invaded.
The Italians committed 200,000 troops, including their own colonial cavalry and infantry, commanded by General Emilio de Bono. Their infantry were supported by 150 light tanks and over 700 pieces of artillery. Though the Ethiopians, led by Emperor Haile Selassie, could muster about 350,000 men, they were almost totally lacking in modern artillery and armor. Of greater importance was the Regia Aeronautica, the Italian Air Force. With only about 50 anti-aircraft guns, the Ethiopians could do virtually nothing against their strafing and bombing. However, they fought a series of valiant rearguard actions as the Italians advanced deeper into their country. But greater numbers of more up-to-date weapons invariably overwhelmed them. Where the resistance was strongest, the Italians used gas. Bit by bit, what became known as the Rape of Ethiopia was completed. The Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa fell in May 1936, and Mussolini had added another country to his new Roman Empire. Where would he strike next? In 1939, the German dictator Adolf Hitler's conquest of Poland was followed by the phony war. However, on May the 10th, 1940, it was the long-awaited Nazi blitzkrieg that struck at the Low Countries. Operation Sicklestroke, which replaced the compromised Operation Gelb, was launched with 136 divisions in 3 army groups. The 2 northern groups targeted Belgium and the Netherlands, whilst the third group would attack northeastern France. Within 5 days, the Dutch army formally surrendered. The Belgian forces followed suit 13 days later. As the Germans pushed forward into the tank country of southern Belgium and northern France, the full effect of the blitzkrieg began to be seen. The battle for France and the Low Countries now saw the first use of the highly capable 88mm anti-aircraft gun in the anti-tank role. Allied armour would again encounter this formidable weapon in North Africa. 16 days after the initial German attack, Operation Dynamo began the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force and elements of the French army from Dunkirk. They were forced to leave virtually all of their equipment behind. The rapid defeat by the Germans on mainland Europe forced the Royal Navy to begin withdrawing warships to cover the expected invasion of Britain, leaving no British battleships in the Mediterranean. Paris was now the objective as the battle for France proper began on June the 5th. In less than a month, the Germans had decimated the armies of 4 countries. Almost 2 million French troops were captured. Many of these were from her African colonies. The Germans entered the French capital on June the 14th. 5 days earlier, the opportunistic Mussolini had declared war on Britain and France, and the Royal Navy had dispatched 6 submarines to attack Italian harbours and naval bases in the Mediterranean. As the Germans advanced south, the French ordered the battleship Richelieu to leave Brest for Dakar, and the incomplete Jean Bart to sail under half power from Saint-Nazaire to Casablanca. The Franco-German armistice was signed in the third week of June. In theory, the new French government based at Vichy was neutral, but in practice collaborated with the Germans. After their successes in the north, the Germans occupied the whole of western France as far south as the Spanish border. Strategic ports such as Saint-Nazaire and Bordeaux were secured. Positions along the coast were fortified against small raids, but since Hitler was already preparing for Operation Sail-Away, the invasion of England, the Germans felt no threat of invasion themselves. That would come later. For now, the conquerors had their place in the sun. Ever the opportunist, Mussolini sent troops onto the French Riviera, but these were soon to be withdrawn. Life settled down under the Vichy government. Toulon was the home of the French Mediterranean fleet, where there still remained a sizable portion of the French Navy. Though the warships in Toulon might be relatively safe, for the British, neutralizing the remaining Vichy French naval assets both in the Mediterranean and in West Africa now became a priority. British planning had never envisaged fighting a war in Mussolini's lake without the support of the French Mediterranean fleet. Now there was every chance that the warships in Vichy France's African colonies might return to France and cooperate with the Axis navies. Both the French and the Royal Navy used the port of Alexandria in Egypt. British and French sailors mingled happily in the city. Prior to the fall of France, the French had put their Eastern Mediterranean squadron at Alexandria at the disposal of the Royal Navy. On the fall of France, this unit, Force X, comprised the battleship Lorraine, 4 cruisers, and 5 torpedo boats. Fortunately, Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, commanding the British Mediterranean fleet, was able to negotiate a peaceful internment of this force.
To eliminate the other French naval threats, the first target chosen was at Mers-el-Kabir.
On July the 3rd, Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville was off that port with the newly created Force H from Gibraltar. This comprised the battlecruiser Hood, the battleships Valiant and Resolution, and the carrier Ark Royal. Somerville was astonished when ordered by Prime Minister Winston Churchill to give an ultimatum to the French to join the Royal Navy, scuttle their ships, or face attack. The French refused, and Operation Catapult began. The French ships at anchor in Mers-el-Kabir were sitting ducks. As they attempted to get underway, the elderly battleship Britannia was hit in her after magazine, blew up and capsized with the loss of 977 of her crew. The scenes in the harbour were absolute chaos. As the bombardment continued, the Dunkirk was hit by a salvo of 4 15-inch shells and crippled. The Provence did manage to get moving, but ran aground in the harbour. Only the Strasbourg managed to reach the open sea and return fire. She escaped unscathed and reached Toulon. The next day, Swordfish from Ark Royal returned to try and sink the Dunkirk, but hit a lighter full of depth charges, killing another 150. The French lost a total of 1,297 during the bombardment of Mers-el-Kabir. This unprovoked but necessary attack by a recent ally was to influence Anglo-Vichy-French relations later in the war. 6 days after Mers-el-Kabir, the Royal Navy caught the Italian fleet off Cape Spartivento.
Another major action that we took part in Force H was the Battle of Cape Spartivento, which was the last major sea battle fought by battleships. I sailed into action as senior subaltern in the Nine alongside Ramillies, an R-class battleship. If I remember rightly, the battle didn't last very long, as the Italian fleet who were enemies, scuttled into Genoa harbour as quick as they could.
As part of Operation Catapult, though far distant, the carrier Hermes attacked the battleship Richelieu at Dakar in French West Africa. Richelieu was disabled in the stern by a swordfish's torpedo, but not sunk. 2 months later, Force H returned to Dakar, again with Barham, Resolution and Ark Royal, and a cruiser escort including HMAS Australia, Cumberland and Devonshire. Codenamed Operation Menace, the intention was to land a force of Free French to capture the port. This was led by General Charles de Gaulle, but the invasion was badly organized and clumsily handled. The Vichy French rejected surrender negotiations and the invasion was aborted. Barham and Resolution now engaged the Richelieu, which was immobilized but able to fire her guns. In Dakar, Richelieu had been reinforced just before the arrival of the task force by 3 cruisers, and her 15-inch salvos bracketed Barham several times. Finally, Resolution was torpedoed by the Vichy submarine Bavazière. Listing badly, the crew fought to keep the ship afloat. Finally, she was taken in tow by Barham. The whole abortive operation was called off. Though Operation Menace was a failure, Cunningham's attack on Vichy naval assets had been a monumental success. Of the 7 French battleships in North African waters, 1 had been sunk, 3 severely damaged, and 1 interned. Only 1 had escaped, though the incomplete Jean Bart remained untouched at Casablanca. The French Navy was effectively neutralized. 10 days before the British attack on Dakar, the Italians struck at Egypt. It coincided with the height of the Battle of Britain.
On September the 13th, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, with 4 divisions and an armoured group of the Italian 10th Army, drove across the Egyptian frontier towards Alexandria.
Graziani took Sidi Barrani but halted just beyond the town, 70 miles short of Mersa Matruh and still some 250 miles away from Alexandria. Here he waited, while the highway at Ceylon was extended to Sidi Barrani so that he could bring up reinforcements and supplies. The Italian invasion of Egypt ground to a halt. With his troops stalled just outside Egypt, Mussolini now turned his attention across the Adriatic to the Balkans. His new target was Greece. It was known that neither Yugoslavia nor Turkey would support their Balkan Pact ally. Italy had occupied Albania in 1939, and this country would now be used as a convenient springboard for the attack. On October the 28th, 1940, the Italians pounced. The Regia Aeronautica attacked the Greek mainland and ports, while 6 divisions invaded northern Greece on 2 fronts. Almost immediately, the autumn rains began to affect the campaign. Aircraft were frequently grounded. On the battlefront, the mud and swollen rivers slowed the Italian advance to a crawl. This favored the Greeks, who now had time to mobilize their 16 divisions. Up to 380 aircraft of the Italian Air Force were used in the campaign. Even when they could get airborne, they were unable to prevent the concentration of Greek troops. On November the 14th, the Greeks counterattacked into Albania, and as the winter set in, the front stabilized into a stalemate. Yet again, Mussolini's ambitions had been thwarted. In the Mediterranean, Admiral Cunningham tasked the new British carrier Illustrious with a daring attack on the Italian fleet. Aerial reconnaissance told Cunningham that all 6 Italian battleships were at Taranto. Illustrious steamed for southern Italy, her 16 Swordfish torpedo bombers reinforced with 5 from Eagle. On the evening of November the 11th, they attacked the Italian fleet. flying in 2 waves, 11 dropped torpedoes and the remainder bombs and flares. The devastating attack put the Caio Duilio and the new Littorio out of action for 6 months. Illustrious returned in triumph to Malta. Balance of naval power had shifted decidedly in favour of the Royal Navy. In the Western Desert there had been constant skirmishing with the Italians. Events there were also about to change for the better as the British prepared to go on the attack. Operation Compass was supposed to last 5 days. It was designed as a relatively local operation to overcome the Italians' forward positions in Egypt, threatening Mersa Matruh and Alexandria. The attack began on December the 9th and Sidi Barrani fell 2 days later. Within a week, the artillery was shelling Ceylon on the Libyan border. So successful was the British offensive that Wavell ordered his men to push on to Libya. Tobruk was captured on January the 22nd. With the Italians retreating in disorder, the Australians were now advancing along the coast via Benghazi while the British armour cut across the desert. By February the 7th, the 2-pronged attack had trapped the Italians at Beda Fom. Of the 250,000 Italian troops defending Libya, 130,000 were captured, together with over 300 tanks and almost 850 pieces of artillery. The advance then continued as far as El Agheila. The Italian army in Libya had effectively been decimated. Hitler reacted immediately to the spectacular Italian defeat during Operation Compass. On February the 14th, lead elements of the Deutsche Afrika Korps started to arrive in Tripoli. The Germans were commanded by Lieutenant General Rommel. The year before, he had defeated the British at Arras and Saint-Valery in northern France and was to become by far the most successful German general of the Desert War. German High Command had authorized him to attack into Cyrenaica and to retake Benghazi in May. Rommel had other plans, and within 5 weeks he'd opened up his first offensive, capturing El Agheila. Supported by their artillery, the Germans advanced rapidly. By April the 4th, they'd recaptured Benghazi and continued to pound the retreating British and Commonwealth troops. German 88 played havoc with British tanks, whose armour was simply too thin to deflect the shells. The British were driven headlong back to the Egyptian border, leaving Tobruk to be besieged. In just over 3 weeks, Rommel had recaptured Libya. Coinciding with Rommel's offensive, Italian destroyers began leaving the port by the end of March. Vittorio Veneto and 8 cruisers. The Navy was making a rare sortie, this time against the British convoys from Egypt to Greece. Air reconnaissance warned Admiral Cullingham in Alexandria that the Italian fleet was west of Crete. He put to sea with the new fleet carrier HMS Formidable and the battleships Barham, Valiant and Warspite, newly equipped with radar. On March the 28th, aircraft from Formidable located the Italians off Cape Matapan in southern Greece. 2 airstrikes from Formidable managed to slow the retreating Vittorio Veneto, but Cullingham's battleships were still over 80 miles away. The Italian cruisers gathered around the battleship to protect her when a third attack under vicious anti-aircraft fire was made. The cruiser Pola was crippled, but Vittorio Veneto managed to escape westwards. As darkness fell, some of the destroyers, together with the cruiser Zara and Fiume, were sent back to help Pola. All 3 were located by radar and sunk by the British 15-inch guns in a 10-minute bombardment. 2 Italian destroyers fell victim soon after. With blackened gun muzzles, the British fleet returned to port. The day after Cape Matapan, the Italian Navy was ordered not to venture outside the protection of land-based fighters. In February 1941, Churchill ordered that priority be given to the campaign in Greece. In early March, 58,000 British and Commonwealth troops were dispatched from Egypt. The Greeks had been successfully defending the Albanian front for 4 months against the Italians, but following Bulgaria's entry into the war, the balance of power in the Balkans was now shifting in favour of the Axis powers. The contingent for Greece comprised of over half of the British 2nd Armoured Division and the 6th Australian and 2nd New Zealand Infantry Divisions. Though badly needed back in Egypt, they were about to be frittered away in a strategically unimportant campaign. Scarcely had they arrived when the Germans struck. On April the 6th, they invaded Yugoslavia and Greece with 15 divisions to support their Italian allies. Amongst these were their Fallschirmjäger or paratroops, which had been used so successfully in Belgium and Holland. It had been expected that they might be used for an airborne assault on Malta, but were now in action in Greece. As the invaders swept south, resistance collapsed. Yugoslavia fell after 11 days, and the Greek army in Thrace surrendered 3 days later. The remaining Greek forces and British and Commonwealth troops began to fall back. The daring mission undertaken by the paratroopers during this campaign was to capture the vital bridge over the Corinth Canal. On April the 26th, the 2nd Fallschirmjäger Regiment dropped on their target. The bridge was well defended and already mined with demolition charges. The Germans managed to seize the crossing and began to dismantle the charges, but the defenders fired at them and blew the bridge. The next day, the Germans entered Athens. Within 7 weeks, over 3,000 British troops had been killed, wounded, or were missing. Another 9,000 were captured. The remainder had been withdrawn to Egypt and Crete. Almost immediately, detailed planning started for Operation Merkur, the invasion of Crete. However, it took some time to gather the necessary troops, transports and gliders for the assault because they were scattered across Europe. Crete was a strategic objective. Capturing the island would provide important airfields from which to resupply Rommel in Libya and to strike directly at Egypt. Axis aircraft could also interdict the vital convoys from Alexandria to Malta. Finally, the 490 Junkers transports plus 70 gliders to be used in the assault took off from airfields near Athens. The attack force was General Kurt Student's 7th Air Division of 8,100 men. It comprised 3 parachute regiments, divisional artillery, engineers and signals, and the Airborne Assault Regiment. Elements of the 5th and 6th Mountain Divisions would follow by sea. On May the 20th, Student's force crossed the 160 miles from the Greek mainland and dropped Heraklion. Because of weight restrictions, airborne had to be armed, and it was essential for the Fallschirmjäger to quickly gather their personal weapons from the containers parachuted in with them. Crete was defended by a Greek force and by men of the 6th Australian and 2nd New Zealand Infantry Divisions who had been evacuated from Greece. Much of their equipment had been left on the Greek mainland. They were short of practically everything, but particularly barbed wire, artillery, ammunition, and anti-aircraft guns. The Germans rapidly overwhelmed the defenders, and within 10 days it was all over. British and Commonwealth forces lost almost 3,500 killed or wounded and almost 12,000 captured. So ended the tragic campaign for Greece.
As the campaign on Crete was nearing its end, the British were reinforcing the garrison on Cyprus.
Important little island in the Mediterranean, from the quiet ways of peace, with its olive groves and grapes and pomegranates, it has become a strategic center in the Middle East zone of this world war. These are the first pictures of Middle East troops embarking for Cyprus. Obviously not many are shown here, because it is undesirable to crowd the docks with masses of troops at one time. But the great importance of Cyprus can be seen from the map. For Germany it would be an excellent jumping off ground for an attack on Syria or Palestine or Egypt. Now in the harbour at Famagusta, another convoy of transport and supply ships is unloading its contribution to the defense of the island, an endless stream of the countless requirements of our modern army. Let us hope that we shall hear no more foolishness about the impossibility of a German invasion by any particular method. Let us hope, as seems to be the case, that in Cyprus the military commanders are able to prepare defense for any type of attack. It is of the utmost urgency that aerodromes should be strongly defended, both from air attack and from troops who might be on the ground. This is the effective, though rather primitive means by which guns are hauled into position. Everywhere sandbags are being filled to build emplacements and light attack posts. And the big guns go laboriously home. Cyprus has not lost its touch of the picturesque. Indeed, the Cypriot islanders have turned to with enthusiasm to help in the building of the camp. Beside the everyday needs of an army, the more urgent work of building aerodromes goes on at full pressure. Ancient and modern join the centuries in preparing the ground for Fleet Air Arm and the RAF. Water keeps the eternal dust in check, while the rollers and levelers are working a non-stop day. No doubt many lessons have been learned from the loss of Crete. One great lesson was the vital necessity of sufficient air strength. This must never be forgotten.
Only about 400 miles from Crete, the island's garrison force is continually being strengthened by the addition of Cypriots, recruited from its population of over 300,000 people. British Army instructors, responsible for their training, are building up a fighting force capable of resisting any attack if and when the time comes. The experience of Crete demands that every man should be able to handle automatic weapons of all kinds. The immediate future of Cyprus will be worth watching. Another island, but a possible stepping stone to bigger things.
In the summer of 1941, Malta was facing sometimes 4 or 5 air raids a day. Also of great concern was the damage to the carrier Formidable by the Luftwaffe off Crete. Vulnerable to further air attacks, she was withdrawn through the Suez Canal in July. This left Force H with only Ark Royal to guarantee Malta's resupply and survival.
These latest pictures from Malta show some of the work of the Fleet Air Arm, which has done such noble duty since the start of the war. Albacores being serviced and loaded up with torpedoes for attacks on enemy shipping. For Malta now is a base for attack, no longer a beleaguered fortress. These pictures come to us just after the big debate in the House of Lords and the recent speech by the First Lord of the Admiralty. Many speakers have pressed for better equipment for the aerial arm of the Royal Navy, and all will applaud that demand. The importance of the Fleet Air Arm cannot possibly be exaggerated. The finest seaborne warplanes for attack and defense can turn the scale in modern naval action.
But the island was terribly short of warplanes to take on modern Axis fighters and bombers. It was now essential to get more fighters through to defend the island fortress. During June, in an heroic effort, the carriers Ark Royal, Victorious and Furious managed to fly off no less than 142 aircraft to Malta. On July the 21st, this was followed by Operation Substance, escorting a 7-ship replenishment convoy from Gibraltar. Warships were provided by Force H with Ark Royal reinforced by a powerful squadron from the British Home Fleet. Battleships included the Nelson and Renown. Operation Substance was fairly typical of the enemy response to a Gibraltar-Malta convoy. As the ships sailed further east into the Mediterranean, they came under increasingly heavy attacks from Axis bombers based in Sardinia.
During our Malta convoys, which was escorting ships, merchant ships, through the Mediterranean as far as Malta, we were under fairly constant air threat and occasional air attack. I think we would have been at action stations all the time.
During substance, British air cover came from Ark Royal's Fulmar fighter bombers. As the battle intensified, the carrier escort was withdrawn to Gibraltar. As the convoy got closer to Malta, the air raids increased in ferocity, now with aircraft from both Sardinia and Sicily. The convoy battled on. During July the 23rd, the cruiser Manchester was hit, and 2 destroyers, including HMS Fearless, were lost. But the attackers were driven off or destroyed. As the convoy neared Malta, a new threat emerged. Italian MTBs emerged from their bases in Sardinia and Sicily. During Operation Substance, they attacked and succeeded in torpedoing a cargo ship on July the 24th. But the convoy still pressed on, and the same day the badly needed supplies finally reached Malta. The third Malta convoy of 1941, Operation Halberd, followed in September. On November the 12th, Ark Royal, together with HMS Argus, flew off 37 Hurricanes to Malta. The next day, disaster struck, and Ark Royal was sunk by U-81, the first British carrier loss in the Mediterranean. On Malta in the autumn of 1941, the incessant air raids continued unabated. But the air assets of the island had begun to improve. The capability to strike at Axis shipping crossing the Mediterranean between Italy and Libya was greatly enhanced with the arrival of a small force of Blenheim and Wellington bombers. Also, limited strikes against Tripolitania now became possible. Everyone was co-opted.
I was in Malta at the time. In fact, I was leading 6 Blenheims out to Singapore. When I say I was hijacked at Malta because the Air Marshal there, Hugh Pugh Lloyd, pulled me off the transit list. The other 5 went on to Singapore. Next day I was operating in Blenheims at Malta as a replacement for the losses they had had. I was a sergeant pilot. 6 weeks later, we've lost every officer in the squadron.
But air cover was more critical. In early August there had been 75 Hurricanes on Malta, but losses on the ground and in the air kept depleting the numbers. By October, of all types deployed, only 66 were serviceable, and by the spring of 1942, the height of the air battle, there would only be 32 Hurricanes and 15 Spitfires available. Anti-aircraft defences had been considerably improved, and enemy aircraft approaching the island were likely to receive an increasingly hot reception from the ground.
On the 18th of November, the 8th Army went on the offensive in Operation Crusader, driving into Cyrenaica.
In support of Operation Crusader, the battleships Valiant, Queen Elizabeth and Barham, with their escorting cruisers, left Alexandria. They were to supply long-range naval gunfire in support of the 8th Army's advance.
Though initially battered by the Germans, the 8th Army persevered and Rommel decided to retreat west. The siege of Tobruk was raised on December the 8th. Badly weakened, Rommel now withdrew beyond Benghazi.
From April the 13th to December the 8th, 1941, the Tobruk ferry had delivered over 32,000 troops and 34,000 tons of supplies to the besieged town. It had also evacuated 7,500 wounded and almost the same number of Axis prisoners of war, often under sustained air attacks. In late November off Bardia, U-331 located and torpedoed the battleship Barham, which was returning from supporting Crusader. As she rolled over, a disastrous explosion killed 862 of her crew. The sinking of several British capital ships in the Mediterranean during the autumn of 1941 was matched by American losses when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December the 7th. This immediately brought the USA, with its enormous reserves of manpower and materiel, into the war against the Axis powers. At the end of December 1941, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Churchill and his 3 service chiefs went to the USA. There they met President Franklin Roosevelt and his military commanders, their new allies, to shape the future political and military strategy of the war. The inclination of the USA was to go all out in the war against Japan. But at this, the first Washington Conference, it was instead decided that priority should be given to the European and Mediterranean theatres. The cooperation of the Allied military command was to become a feature of the Second World War. By the end of 1941, Operation Crusader had taken the Eighth Army beyond Benghazi, but their lines of communication were 300 miles long, and they were overextended and off balance. For Rommel, his lines of supply were relatively short, and in early January 1942, a resupply convoy had got through to him at Tripoli. On January the 21st, the newly created Panzerarmee Africa took the offensive and 8 days later re-entered Benghazi.
Panzerarmee Africa drove on to within 30 miles of Gazala, where it was checked by strong defensive positions built by the Eighth Army.
With the capture of the major airfield at Benghazi, Rommel could now receive troop reinforcements by air. From here, the Alexandria to Malta convoys could be threatened, as well as by aircraft operating out of Crete. And from the recaptured airfields, the Luftwaffe was better able to strike at the airstrips of the Desert Air Force and engage them in the air. The Washington Conference had acknowledged the strategic importance of Malta. The problem was always resupply, and because of the attacks on convoys, that was erratic. Both soldiers and civilians grew food to augment the meagre rations. Communal feeding stations were established to keep the population going. By April 1942, the air raids on the island were reaching a crescendo. These raids, together with the damage and deprivations, could have sapped the islanders' morale. For its given land area and population, Malta had been more heavily blitzed than London. But Malta had to be held at all cost. On April the 16th, in consideration of its sustained ordeal by fire, Malta and its population were collectively awarded the George Cross.
I think Malta was a very important. When you think where it was situated, it was a very vital thing. If Jerry had actually taken Malta, we'd have been in a lot of trouble. I think Malta was very, very important, the most important island in the Med, I think.
Shortly after the award was announced, the heroic defender of Malta, Lieutenant General Sir William Dobbie, handed over command of the garrison to Field Marshal Lord Gort and returned to London.
I left Malta 48 hours ago, and I left it with the very greatest regret, having served there for 2 years. But I was very glad that the successor to whom I handed it over was Lord Gort, and I'm perfectly certain that the fine spirit which the people in the garrison of Malta have shown in the last 2 years, and the way they have supported me, will be repeated in his case too. And I have no hesitation, I've got no anxiety about the future of Malta so long as that spirit lasts, as I'm sure it will.
The award was actually presented later.
There was a very special ceremony in Malta for the presentation of the George Cross to the island fortress. Lord Gort, the governor, presiding. The Jack still flies proudly over the ruins of the Palace Square, Valletta. Over 2,000 raids have in no way dimmed Malta's great defiance. Lord Gort handed the George Cross and the King's letter to Sir George Borg, the Chief Justice, who placed them on the plinth for all the people to see.
and they didn't exactly hang back. Keen interest and quiet pride could be observed on every face as the ordinary people of Malta, men, women and children, came to look. This decoration is unique, but it belongs to all those people equally, to every one in Malta, in recognition of the inspiring example they've set to the whole empire. The cross and the letter were later to be displayed in all Malta's towns and villages. As battle-scarred George Cross Malta stands firm, undaunted and undismayed, awaiting the time when she can call, "Pass, friend, all is well in the island fortress."
At the end of May 1942, Admiral Cunningham, the mastermind of British naval operations in the Mediterranean, relinquished his command. He went on to take up a post in Washington. The Allies were unaware that at the same time Operation Hercules, the planned German airborne invasion of the island, had been postponed indefinitely. However, Rommel was on the move again. He now attacked the Gazala line, using flak-filling anti-aircraft guns and the dreaded 88s in the anti-tank role. He wore down the defences. While Rommel was driving towards the Egyptian border, the Allies sent a double convoy through to Malta. On June the 12th, under the codename Operation Harpoon, 6 merchantmen sailed from Gibraltar for the island fortress. They were escorted by the battleship Malaya, the cruisers Liverpool and Cairo, and 3 light cruisers with a destroyer screen. Air cover was provided by the carriers Argus and Eagle, the latter operating Sea Hurricanes. 2 days later, Axis aircraft attacked the convoy. 1 merchantman was lost, and the Liverpool so badly damaged that she had to return to Gibraltar. 17 aircraft were downed. The next day, the convoy encountered the 7th Italian Naval Division off Pantelleria. The Italian warships had no radar, and a smokescreen was used effectively by the British in the ensuing battle with the convoy escorts. However, the Cairo was slightly damaged and a destroyer lost. Axis aircraft again hurled themselves at the convoy and sunk a merchantman and a tanker. Finally, Italian mines off Malta accounted for another 2 cargo ships. Out of the 43,000 tons dispatched, only 15,000 got through, but every bit was vital to keep Malta going. On the same day that Harpoon sailed from Gibraltar, the Operation Vigorous convoy, commanded by Rear Admiral Sir Philip Vian, departed Alexandria. It comprised 11 merchantmen with an escort of 8 cruisers and 27 destroyers. Axis aircraft struck the same day, sinking 1 merchantman. 2 days later, a massive air attack took out yet another supply ship. On that day, learning of a sortie against him by 2 Italian battleships and 4 cruisers, Vian turned the convoy back towards Alexandria. As they withdrew, a German E-boat sank one of the destroyers and damaged a cruiser. As the convoy steamed towards Egypt, the Royal Navy lost a cruiser and 2 more destroyers to air and submarine attacks. During Operation Vigorous, 6 warships had been sunk and 9 damaged. Of the 11 cargo ships that had set out, 6 were sunk and 2 crippled, and no supplies had reached Malta. On June the 17th, under pressure from Rommel, the 8th Army started to withdraw east of Tobruk to new positions at El Alamein. 4 days later, the Axis forces assaulted Tobruk. After 2 years of battle that had ebbed and flowed around it, the town finally fell on June the 21st. The day after the capture of Tobruk, Rommel was promoted to Field Marshal, but he didn't rest on his laurels. As the advance continued into Egypt, more British armour and aircraft were destroyed. Finally, Rommel was checked at the defences around El Alamein. On August the 10th, the most famous of all the Malta convoys set sail from Gibraltar. Codenamed Operation Pedestal, it comprised 14 merchantmen and a formidable escort. Besides 7 cruisers and 24 destroyers, there were the battleships Rodney and Nelson. And unusually, there were 3 carriers: Eagle, Victorious and Illustrious. The newsreels take up the story.
His Majesty's Government wished to convey to all officers and men of the Royal Navy and Merchant Navy concerned their admiration of the gallantry and determination with which they have so successfully fought a convoy of supplies through to Malta. These words spoke for all of us, for the enemy had assembled against us a great concentration of aircraft and U-boats. On our side, the convoy certainly had a powerful escort. There were battleships, cruisers and destroyers, and a number of aircraft carriers, making one of the biggest fleet air-arm concentrations of the war. Malta needed supplies, including more fighter planes, and these supplies had to go through. The result was very fierce fighting most of the way. Bombs from high-level attack, bombs from Stukas, torpedoes from planes, as well as torpedoes from U-boats. Against all attacks, our gunners put up a terrific reply. Axis aircraft ran slap into what you might call a spot of flak. Over 300 paid the penalty. There's one going down out of control now. And another out of nearly 70 destroyed for certain. Nearly 70 to our 8. Our losses were heavier in ships though. Eagle, Manchester, Cairo and Foresight, as against at least 2 U-boats and a number of E-boats during a night engagement. But the convoy reached Malta, as Royal Navy and Merchant Navy were determined it should. After battle, thanksgiving. Thanks for safe deliverance and prayers for final victory.
Of the 14 cargo ships which had set out on Pedestal, only 4 reached Malta. The crippled tanker Ohio finally arrived with her precious 10,000 tons of fuel. Her captain, Dudley Mason, was fairly nonchalant about the whole operation.
Captain Mason, one usually thinks of the Mediterranean as a spot to go to for a pleasure cruise, but I imagine you have rather different ideas on the subject.
Yes, I think I have now. I'd always looked on the Mediterranean as a very peaceful and quiet spot where you went for nice holidays, and, well, I'm afraid I've altered my opinion now.
I'm quite certain you have. You were torpedoed, of course. What does it feel like to be torpedoed?
Well, actually, when it happened, I was on the bridge, very near the port side. The ship happened to be torpedoed that side. There was an enormous sheet of flames and deluge of water, reached the masthead height, I suppose. Then seems to be practically 2 seconds of absolute quiet and still.
Well, at any rate, you and the people of Malta have one thing in common for the rest of your lives, and that is the well-deserved award of the George Cross.
Yes, I accept that. It was a wonderful tribute to the whole crew. I like to look at it in that light. The marvelous way they acted, carried out my orders with no hesitation whatever, and the courageous way they carried the whole operation to a conclusion.
At the end of August, Rommel again went on the offensive around El Alamein, but by the beginning of September he was short of fuel for his tanks and retired back to his start line. Meanwhile, the 8th Army held its ground and steadied itself after the long retreat. In late October, the reorganized 8th Army opened a massive artillery bombardment at El Alamein. Checked by the Axis forces, British and Empire troops paused to reorganize. Rommel struck back, but was repulsed, and the 8th Army delivered its final armored blow. The fighting was bitter, and 2 days later Rommel gave the orders to retreat back into Libya. Back in July, at a meeting of the combined British and US Chiefs of Staff, a decision had been made to open up a second front in North Africa. This was to be an all-arms operation with troops from both countries. It was to be commanded by an American, Brigadier General Dwight Eisenhower. The planning had its problems because it was proposed to land in French North Africa, controlled by the Vichy government. Marshal Henri Pétain had been the premier of Vichy France since the armistice, but in April 1942 his powers had been handed over to Pierre Laval, who collaborated fully with the Axis powers. Admiral Jean Dalin was the senior Vichy military commander. Though he had kept his promise to Churchill never to surrender the French fleet to the Axis, it wasn't known if the French in North Africa would fight. Another complicating factor was the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco. Although Spain was neutral, there was the possibility that Franco, who in the 1930s had been helped to power by Italy and Germany, might well join in. So in the autumn of 1942, there was the possibility, if the Axis powers got wind of the location of the intended landings, that Germany would move through Spain into Spanish Morocco. Detailed planning continued for Operation Torch, and Eisenhower established his headquarters at Gibraltar, within sight of the North African coast.
One of the most boring jobs we used to get was patrolling the Straits of Gibraltar. You've got lights that side, everybody enjoying themselves. We were going backwards and forwards with the Aztecs spinning away. That used to last about a fortnight, the most boring job in the world. We did go fishing there, on the Aztecs. Skipper turned round to the armory petty officer, and we've got any cracked lines, any lines that are not safe. Yes sir, I can find you one. We found one, over the side, tons of fish came. All the ships in Gibraltar had got fish for supper.
Meticulous timing and planning for the massive undertaking was needed. By the beginning of November, 1 million tons of shipping was on the way. 3 great convoys, 2 from Britain and 1 direct from the USA, were converging undetected on Gibraltar. Warship escort and coastal bombardment was provided by 6 battleships, 81 cruisers, and a myriad of destroyers. Air cover came from 4 British and 1 American carrier, as well as 7 light escort carriers. Operation Torch called for 3 separate task force landings. 2 were in the Mediterranean at Algiers and Oran. The 3rd was to be on the Atlantic coast at Casablanca. All 3 were timed for November the 8th. The Eastern Task Force arrived on schedule off Algiers. It consisted of up to 23,000 British troops and about 10,000 Americans. Though made up of predominantly British troops, because of the bitter memories of the attack on Mers el-Kabir 3 years earlier, it was necessary to maintain the illusion that this was an all-American operation. Therefore, the landing force was commanded by U.S. Major General Charles Ryder. For 16 hours during the first day, the Allied troops poured ashore. After initial token resistance had been overcome, the men marched off to secure the rest of the city and its environs. At dawn on November the 8th, the Central Task Force, which had sailed from Britain, arrived off Oran. It comprised about 39,000 American troops, commanded by Major General Lloyd Fredendall. Here, French warships and naval installations in Iran offered weak opposition. As part of the assault, 500 US paratroops flew directly from Britain to capture Tafarui airfield south of Oran. However, as with many of the early Allied airborne assaults, their drop was widely dispersed. In Iran itself, the task force came under attack from the Vichy French Air Force. They were quickly beaten off with little damage. Part of the 1st Armoured Division, plus a tank destroyer battalion, came ashore from some of the 44 assault ships assigned to the Central Task Force. GIs were transferred from the transports onto their landing craft. Iran was not to be attacked directly, but from landing beaches to the east and west of the city. Naval gunfire softened up the beaches where, in some cases, the landings were unopposed. The major infantry component of the assault was the US 1st Division, the big red one, plus a Ranger battalion. By the end of the day, all the troops and their equipment were ashore. On November the 9th, there was a strong French counterattack, but this was beaten off. The city surrendered at noon on the next day. The Western Task Force had sailed direct from the USA to Casablanca. However, bad weather in the Atlantic threatened the diversion of the 100 transports to Gibraltar. In the end, this was not necessary, and the task force arrived off Casablanca on November the 7th. The next morning, it was shelled by elements of the French fleet, including the partly operational battleship Jean Bart. The American warships, including the battleship Massachusetts, returned fire, and the naval battle raged throughout the day, with 4 French warships sunk. The landings were to be made on either side of the city by about 34,000 American troops under Major General George Patton. After 4 days of fierce fighting, the French surrendered. The torch landings in northwest Africa were important, for they were the first commitment of US forces to the land war in Europe and the Mediterranean. The capture of the Jean Bart at Casablanca proclaimed the end of the French Navy outside of France. It was also the end of the Vichy government, for on November the 11th, the Germans occupied the whole of France. Following Operation Torch and their occupation of Vichy France, the Germans moved troops by sea and air into Tunisia.
We picked up an ASDIC signal off Bougie, Italian sub. We depth charged, we started depth charging her we think about 9 o'clock in the morning. We depth charged her until almost midday, I would think. Stuck my head out the hatch and I could see the sub, she surfaced, and they were all clambering out the conning tower and diving into the water.
But with 3 major ports in French North Africa in Allied hands, and with the 8th Army advancing out of Egypt some 1,200 miles distance, 2 vast pincers were moving together to squeeze the Axis forces between them. Axis supplies were still getting through to North Africa, but only just. Heavy attacks on Axis convoys were now being regularly launched from airfields both to the east and west of Tunisia, and of course from Malta. Heavy bombers could now be sent to Tripoli itself. The port became a death trap for Axis shipping. In mid-January 1943, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill met at Casablanca, which had been captured only 2 months earlier. The purpose of this meeting was to decide on the next phase of the war. Priority was still to be given to the Mediterranean theatre, but there were several options as to where the Allies could strike next. One option was to occupy Sardinia and Corsica. Another was to invade Sicily. The combined chiefs of staff decided that it should be the latter. Taking Sicily would strike a major blow at one of the two European Axis nations, providing a jump-off point for landings on the Italian mainland and might even precipitate an Italian surrender. On January the 23rd, the 8th Army triumphantly rode into Tripoli. Mussolini's dream of a new Roman Empire had come crashing down. It was not all rejoicing, though, because, like the Desert Air Force, the Desert Rats would shortly lose their independence under Eisenhower's command.
In Malta, Squadron Leader Lynch, an American commanding a Spitfire squadron, has just shot down the 1,000th enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat from the island. Fighter squadrons based on Malta are celebrating the occasion as they strike at Italy and her islands with increasing vigor.
In early July, the King visited Malta.
The King's arrival aboard the light cruiser Aurora in the Grand Harbour Valletta, only about 60 miles from Sicily, was itself a striking comment on the tremendous change in the Mediterranean situation. It underlined, as nothing else could, the fact that those grim days of Malta's very nearly complete isolation were over. Governor, Field Marshal Lord Gort, VC, received the King in the name of the people of the George Cross Island. After lunching at the Verdala Palace, the King, accompanied by the Catholic Archbishop, went to make a close personal inspection of the bomb-shattered island, whose raids numbered thousands, but whose single-hearted determination to hold out never faltered. The King saw the devastation that had been caused, and I have no doubt that in thanking the Maltese people for their devotion to the great cause, he told them how the people of Britain, themselves not exactly strangers to the Blitz, honor the island fortress. He went out to Lucca Airfield, Malta's principal air station, where he was attended by Air Vice Marshal Park, another service chief who was knighted during the King's visit, and he went up into the control tower. It was chiefly from this much-bombed airfield that the island's few remaining aircraft hit back at the Axis squadrons in those dark days. Now, of course, Malta's aircraft are on the attack. His Majesty, driving through the streets, everywhere received a superlative welcome. Surely not even the King can ever have been more touched by popular acclamation than here.
Even before the victory in North Africa, Allied planners were at work preparing for the invasion of Sicily. Churchill attended a meeting at Algiers in late May 1943 with the British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden and General Sir Alan Brooke. Also present were General George Marshall and General Eisenhower. There were now strong indications of surrender in the event of an invasion of the Italian mainland. All along the North African coast from Algiers to Tunis, preparations were underway for the invasion of Italy. The two Allied armies to be used for the invasion required huge amounts of equipment. Over 2,500 ships would be required to transport the men and materiel to the beaches.
July the 10th, attack on Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, would be the prelude to the invasion of mainland Italy.
The supporting naval forces sailed from Malta and elsewhere. A heavy naval bombardment provided by 6 battleships and 18 cruisers preceded the landings before dawn. Despite the bad weather, the landings went smoothly and the troops and equipment were soon reaching the shore. Within the first 2 days, the Allies landed 80,000 men and 300 tanks.
A further naval bombardment by 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers were deployed against Axis troops. both the German Hermann-Göring Division and the Italian Livorno Division were badly mauled from the sea. By the end of July, the Americans were driving to the northeast, heading for Palermo and Messina. On their right flank, the 8th Army was now fighting beyond Catania. The terrain was difficult between Mount Etna and the sea, and the enemy's defense was stubborn. As the Allies approached the Sicilian capital, King Victor Emmanuel deposed Mussolini. The first of the dictators had fallen. The Allied pincer movement now closed in on Messina, which fell on August the 17th. Axis losses were over 30,000 killed or wounded, and there were 130,000 prisoners of war. Mainland Italy was clearly visible to the Allied commanders across the Straits of Messina. Maintaining their impetus and to catch the Axis forces off guard, the Allies prepared to launch Operation Baytown, the landings on mainland Italy. This was to be centered on Reggio Calabria. At dawn on September the 3rd, the two 8th Army divisions crossed the straits and swarmed ashore against little opposition. They quickly established a 10-mile bridgehead on the Italian mainland. This prompted the agreement of an immediate armistice between Italy and the Allies, and more followed.
The Royal Navy leads them in. The bulk of the Italian fleet got away and surrendered according to the terms of the armistice. After the loss of the Roma, sunk by German bombs, the Italians rendezvoused the Royal Naval Escort and steamed towards Malta. Warspite, Valiant and British destroyers heading the line. The rendezvous was at 9:30 on the morning of the 10th of September, and these pictures of the surrender taken by the RAF show the ships nearing the George Cross Island. The Italian warships had been ordered to fly a black pennant for easy recognition, as well as their own ensigns. The battleships included two of the Littorio class, the Littorio herself, renamed Italia, and the Vittorio Veneto, 35,000-ton, 30-knot ships. Pretty sure to come in handy, one would think, and that goes for the Cavour class too. There were 5 cruisers, all 6-inch gun vessels, built very largely for speed, and very well built too from that point of view, as they've already proved. Also, of course, a number of destroyers. This was by no means all, but the fleet had divided into 2 parts after the German bombing, and we shall presently see more of the great surrender after the arrival at Malta. Malta was indeed well chosen as the first destination. It was certainly appropriate that this island, which the Axis tried so hard but so vainly to subdue, should have the privilege of seeing the enemy ships in our power intact. There was in fact considerable excitement ashore, and not exactly surprising. It wasn't long before the Italian Admiral Zara came ashore to report to our CNC. Honorable treatment was accorded, of course, and Zara saluted everybody as often as possible. But what a moment for Admiral of the Fleet Sir Andrew Cunningham. Nothing but surrender such as this could fully mark Britain's total naval victory in the Mediterranean. It was a moment that very few admirals can have experienced in the whole history of naval warfare. By now, of course, the rest of the Italian fleet had arrived. Some had come from Spezia, others from Taranto, and, well, there they were. Newsreel cameramen were soon out for a closer inspection. The Andrea Doria, an elderly battleship of the Cavour class, but modernized, 23,000 tons with 10 12.6-inch guns. And a sister ship, the Caio Duilio. Cruisers, various types of the Condottieri class. Plus destroyers of the Artiglieri class and many more. Well, it's always been a saying in the Royal Navy that you can't have too many destroyers. An early count listed 27 of them as having come in, altogether a sizable fleet. And as Admiral Cunningham is reported to have remarked, if nothing else came out of Italy's surrender, it would still have been well worth achieving. But of course the Italian fleet is by no means all, as time will show.
With Operation Slapstick, the British 1st Airborne Division would land by sea at Taranto, while Operation Avalanche would put a larger force ashore at Salerno, south of Naples. On September the 9th, the landings went in along 20 miles of coast near Salerno. Initial German resistance was weak, but they quickly launched a spirited ground and air counter-attack. Transports offshore were particularly vulnerable. Allied warships continued to bombard the enemy and gradually force them back into the surrounding area. Montgomery's 8th Army, meanwhile, was pushing up the chin of the boot of Italy. They finally linked up with the 5th Army on September the 16th. Southern Italy had been secured, but where next? Allied forces were already on the move to the west of Italy. On September the 18th, German forces started to evacuate Sardinia. 2 days later, Allied forces landed on Corsica.
Now the initiative is with the United Nations. This is how French troops and the goons from the former French Empire sailed the Mediterranean in secrecy to land in Corsica. Patriots had already begun the work of expelling the Germans from this island which they had controlled since 1940. Under the terms of the armistice with France, they had tried to make it an outpost of their fortress in Europe, but the fighting French who landed were received everywhere enthusiastically, in this birthplace of another little man who tried to rule the world. Stretcher bearers figured among the Italian units which gave help against the Germans. But the Italians' value as an assistant in battle is too uncertain to be relied upon. Our late enemies have a hard path yet to tread before the fighting man will accept the sincerity of Italian friendship. Above the village of Patrimonio, the fighting French opened mortar fire on the German defense unit. Serious fighting lasted less than 3 weeks before the French command in North Africa was able to announce the reconquest of Corsica. But these pictures paint an accurate picture of the wild and open nature of the campaign. Soldiers and civilian islanders jumbled together, a lonely, desolate place, primitive to a degree. But while it remained in German hands, it had been a serious obstacle to Allied progress. Corsica reconquered, another step on the road back. The bad old days when the Germans won every battle are gone, for good we hope. Berlin announced that all German troops had been successfully withdrawn to the Italian mainland, a masterpiece of organization. The Allies are set firmly on the way towards organizing all German troops back to Germany.
Outstanding example of combined operations in this war is the British-American Air-Sea Rescue Service in the Mediterranean area, where countless operational missions are flown over water. The fighter or bomber pilot who takes his ship aloft over Mare Nostrum is secure in the knowledge that behind him, a nimble, highly specialized organization stands by to assist in case of emergency. He knows that a single call, Mayday Jackpot, for instance, will set in motion a network of mechanical hands, eyes, and ears, day or night, the product of staff work and inter-allied cooperation. Four P-47 fighters head for enemy territory. While back at this British air base in Corsica sits a venerable amphibian, affectionately dubbed Walrus by her crew. At low speed, she can skim the tops of waves, cover large areas, land on the ocean, and carry smoke bombs for use as rescue markers. The ground crew keeps her ready for flight at all times. And here at a nearby base lies a rakish fleet of British high-speed launches, HSL for short, ready to cast off in a matter of seconds. Beneath those decks throb powerful engines, waiting.
Mayday, jackpot, lever, oval, king, 23-02.
Only 3 pilots returned to base, 1 P-47 down in the sea.
23-02.
A lone radar fixer station overlooking the sea, one of many similar stations, picks up the pilot's distress signal. The ears of the air-sea rescue system are in action. Quickly the information is relayed to Sector Operations Headquarters. Other stations of the network have picked up the same call, and their information also speeds into headquarters. From all these fixes, the fixer teller plots the downed man's exact position and phones it into the combined operations room. A pointer is placed on the plotting board and a marker on the area map spotting the pilot's last position. The information is also relayed into the operations room next door. Here the deputy controller has it recorded by the fighter plotter on the interceptor board. Rapid calculations are made to figure the quickest possible course for the air-sea rescue. The data is passed up to the sector controller, who's in charge of the whole show. He immediately alerts the rescue system, while last-minute information, continually being received, verified, and recorded, gives as close as possible the last known position of the downed pilot. The sector controller calls the nearest walrus base. In order to save time, the walrus pilot himself copies the information and starts on his way. The pilot checks once more with the CO. The course is plotted, a last few words of advice, and pilot and his gunner are on their way. Simultaneously, the sector controller phones the high-speed launch base. Well-trained sailors cast off lines, and the HSL sets course for the rescue run. Radio bearings, the walrus adds sharp eyes to scan the miles and miles of sea. While below, the launch hurries to the scene of the SOS before the flyer can drift from his original position. In a few minutes, that tiny speck on the sea is spotted. With a smoke bomb, the pilot's position is marked. The captain sights the marker and corrects his course. Sea rescue system reach out to pull an American pilot to safety. Bombers and fighters are replaceable, but a pilot represents the training, the skill, and the combat experience that is not built on a production line. Combined operations, the cooperation of British and Americans in a well-planned organization, have done it again. Another priceless fighter pilot has been saved to fly once more.
Foggia on the east coast of Italy fell to the British 8th Army on September the 27th, along with its important railway junction and airfield. 4 days later, the US 5th Army entered Naples on the west coast. The city was vital to the Allies because it was the first major port to be captured on the Italian mainland. However, it had been badly damaged by earlier Allied air raids, and the retreating Germans had effectively sabotaged the docks. Repairs got underway immediately. This included raising the ships that had been sunk to block the harbour. Many crewmen, of course, saw service in the smaller warships.
I should have picked up the ship in Gibraltar. Anyway, they said, don't put your kit away. So they put her straight onto a cruiser and said, you're going through to Malta. She probably might be at Malta. So anyway, we go through to Malta. Anyway, I picked the ship up at Malta. Then they said, skipper said, well, we're going to, once we sail, we said we're going to Italy. Eventually we ended up in Naples, which would be the base then. So that's where we worked from that base all the time, from Naples. We've usually got about 4 or 5 sweepers. They in not lying abreast, they're in tandem with us, and they'll sweep with the sweep out, and they sweep an area, or I suppose it could be could be half a mile wide, like the sweep, and we used to go along with the Dans as they swept. So we used to couple all the weights up on the Dans, drop the Dans and mark the buoy, and as the mines came up, we used to have to destroy them.
In Cairo, a series of conferences in the autumn of 1943 saw the first real disagreement between Britain and the USA over strategy. The object of the meeting was to discuss future European and Pacific campaigns. Churchill was overruled by Roosevelt in his objection to the presence of China's Chiang Kai-shek. He feared that great emphasis would now go to Chiang's war in Southeast Asia, while he himself favoured expanding the campaign in the Mediterranean and Aegean. The Americans wanted greater emphasis placed on the planned invasion of Northern Europe. As if to emphasise Churchill's point, 10 days before the Cairo conference started, the Germans struck in the Eastern Aegean. At the beginning of November, elements of the German 22nd Infantry Division had departed mainland Greece by sea. Their objective was to seize Leros, which covered the port of Smyrna, which itself would have become an Allied target in the event of Turkey's entry into the war on the Axis side. Operation Leopard began on November the 12th, when the Germans came ashore. Though they met stiff resistance, the island was in range of the Luftwaffe, and Dornier 217s were able to bomb and strafe the defences. On the same day, Junkers transports, escorted by Arado seaplanes, arrived over Leros. They were carrying a reinforced battalion from the German 2nd Fallschirmjäger Division. Coinciding with the seaborne invasion, they were parachuted onto the island. The battle raged for another 4 days. After particularly fierce fighting, the garrison finally surrendered on November the 16th, and 8,000 British and Italian prisoners were marched into captivity.
The Prime Minister paid a visit to Malta on his way to the Cairo conference, and of course he had an overwhelming reception from the people of the George Cross Island. Whether inspecting the damage done by thousands of attacks, whether talking with the people of Malta about reconstruction and the future of the island, or merely appearing before the crowds, Winston Churchill received ovation after ovation. Not surprising, after all, that Britain's victory planner should be cheered to the echo by people who gave such great proof of their own resolution and their own invincibility.
By the end of 1943, the port of Naples was fully functional. It would eventually handle the bulk of reinforcements for the whole of the Italian campaign. But for now, new armour and equipment was coming ashore for a fresh offensive. The winter of 1943-44 saw the Allies stalled in front of the German Gustav Line. In order to outflank these defences, the Allies proposed to land at Anzio, south of Rome. The task force for Anzio departed Naples on January the 22nd, 1944. To maintain the element of surprise, there was no pre-landing naval bombardment.
After initial successes, the Germans counter-attacked. On the evening of the first day, they began to move reinforcements against Anzio. In a pre-planned operation over the next 2 weeks, 8 German divisions were moved to the area. The vicious battle for Anzio beachhead was to last 4 months.
To the east, the British 8th Army was in action in the region of the Abruzzi Mountains and the Liri Valley. Both the weather and the terrain made progress slow. Finally, the German defences began to crumble when the British 8th and US 5th Armies assaulted the Gustav Line in mid-May. After 4 months, US armour could finally emerge from the Anzio bridgehead. The Allies took Rome on June the 4th, 2 days before the D-Day landings in France. Axis shipping was still operating from the North Italian ports. This included the important naval base at La Spezia, now under German control. Sometimes these targets were simply too difficult or highly defended to attack by conventional means. In response, the British had produced the Chariot human torpedo. The concept had been developed by the Italians, who in 1941 had sunk the British battleships Queen Elizabeth and Valiant in Alexandria harbour. In January 1943, Britain had used its chariots to penetrate Palermo harbour. Now they were used again against La Spezia, where they sank the Italian cruiser Bolzano, captured by the Germans. The chariot was usually transported by submarine to the target area. It had a crew of 2 and a range of about 15 miles. The crew would normally surface close by to visually locate the target. The standard attack was made below the target vessel. The warhead could also be placed on the water line. The nose of the torpedo comprised a 650-pound charge of minnow, fitted with a clock fuse. Once alongside, the charge was detached from the torpedo and magnetically secured to the target vessel. Escape from the target was made underwater and was often more risky than the approach. It was a highly dangerous method of attacking enemy shipping. In Britain, planning for the invasion of France had started in early 1944. The Western Allies intended to open a second front in Northern Europe to relieve the pressure on the Russians advancing from the east. Some of the Allies' most successful generals from the Mediterranean theatre, including Montgomery, Bradley and Air Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, were drafted in to serve under the new Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower. The target of Operation Overlord was Normandy, between the base of the Cherbourg Peninsula and Caen. Throughout June, reinforcements poured ashore. By the end of June, the Allies were strong enough to break out from the invasion beaches. The Allies continued to swiftly exploit their strength. On August the 15th, a second front was opened in France. Operation Dragoon would land the US 7th Army under Lieutenant General Alexandre Patch between Caen and Saint-Tropez on the French Riviera. This was to be the last major amphibious operation in the Mediterranean theatre. A massive bombardment by 5 battleships and 24 cruisers preceded the landings. The troop convoys came from as far away as Oran in North Africa and Taranto in southern Italy. Men of the US 3rd, 36th and 45th Infantry Divisions quickly secured the beaches and began to move inland. They swiftly crushed the German 19th Army, which had lost 3 divisions to the fighting in central France. The 7th Army then rolled north up the valley of the River Rhone, pursuing the fleeing enemy towards the border with Germany. On August the 24th, free French forces entered Paris. The next day, General de Gaulle arrived in the capital to a triumphant welcome. 4 long years of occupation were over. The war in northern Italy continued for another 8 months. The Allies gradually pushed the Germans back towards Austria and Switzerland. On April the 29th, 1945, the formal unconditional surrender of almost 1 million Nazi troops in Italy and Austria was signed at Caserta near Naples. It became effective at noon on May the 2nd. 2 days later, at Lüneburg Heath, General Montgomery accepted the surrender of all German forces in Holland, Denmark and northwest Germany. The war in Europe was over.
The German command to carry out at once, and without argument or comment, all further orders that will be issued by the Allied powers on any subject.
The campaign in northern Africa had swung backwards and forward along the Mediterranean as each side gained the advantage. For the Royal and Merchant Navy in the Mediterranean itself, the struggle had been to keep the sea lanes open and the Italian Navy at bay. And central to all was the valiant defense of Malta, the George Cross Island.